I'm going to talk about the politics of Islam. Last time there was a certain mixture of religion, the beliefs, and politics. Today will be more politics and less belief, and we'll see. I have this map here just to show you where Islam is in the world. It's, as you see, it's all over the Middle East. It's in Central Asia. Down the bottom right, you see Indonesia, which is as we mentioned, the largest Muslim country in the world. But the politics of Islam differs from place to place. And one of the things that I said last week that I wouldn't talk about, but I realize I must, is India and Pakistan. I mean, if you're going to talk about the politics of Islam, you have to mention it. We'll just say a few things about it. You're probably aware, 1947 and 48, India and Pakistan gained independence. And they had the largest population movement in modern times. Tens of millions of people. And you see those arrows on the map. The red arrows suggest Hindus moving into what became India. And the green arrows, people moving into what became Pakistan, or on the east over here, Bangladesh now, after they separated from Pakistan.
Harry, excuse me. You drag the Zoom thing down because it's blocking the bottom of it.
Yeah, it keeps moving.
Drag it. There you go.
Yeah.
Can you go down anymore?
No, that's the problem. You touch it and it appears. Anyway, yeah. Muhammad Jinnah is the leader of what was called the All India Muslim League. And although he originally worked with Gandhi in the Indian National Congress, and the Congress is a party, it's not a Congress, they had a significant disagreement over the use of nonviolence in achieving independence. And Gandhi was also upset over the notion of a separate Muslim community. That is, he felt it was, all India, but that didn't do too well. The Muslims played a significant role in the independence movement, but by 1940, Jinnah is advocating separate Muslim states. Remember, 1947, India becomes independent, and then in 48, I think, Jinnah is named the first, what's called the Governor General of Pakistan. And what you have, here's the partition. If you look at this map, it may be familiar to you, I hope it is. The green is what is now India. It's similar to the map we looked at a minute ago, with some disputed areas. The issue is that Muslims today comprise about 15% of India's population. Now, with a country that big, that's a lot of people, close to 200 million people. Up here in the north, you even have some majority Muslim areas, especially Punjab right here. But the Muslims are all up here in heavy numbers, but they're everywhere. And this migration, as you know, I've read, some people call it the largest migration in human history. There were anywhere from 200,000 to 2 million people were killed. They were killing each other, really ugly. And from India to Pakistan, there were maybe 15 million people. That is, 15 million people are descendants of those who were expelled or left India. And these are some horrible pictures. The one on the left is from the Manchester Guardian, and the one on the right is similar. These are people that are sitting on top of trains. They're trying to get out. I mean, it was just panic. It was really a very difficult situation for huge numbers of people. Well, today, Muslims are about 15% of the population. The Hindus are a much smaller percentage of the Pakistani population. But if you look at that map, the green up top where the Islam is majority, that's Punjab. But as I say, they're all over. And I want to mention up here is a state called Uttarakhand, which we'll mention in just a minute. You'll see why I'm mentioning it. Before the current prime minister, Modi, who is an avowed Hindu nationalist, opinion surveys suggested that people in India were very tolerant of other groups. Here you say 90 in this survey, 91% of the Hindus said that they are very free to practice their religion, and the 85% saying respecting all religions is important to being truly Indian. And the Muslims have almost not quite as many, but still a very large number. It suggests a real tolerant society. On the other hand, one reads about extremists from different parties. You know, Gandhi himself was assassinated by a Hindu. And we're not saying anything about the Sikhs, who are also involved, but a Sikh was involved in the assassination of Indira Gandhi in the late 1970s. But in the state of Uttarakhand, which I just pointed out to you, there is new legislation that says there's a uniform code for marriage, divorce, adoption, and inheritance to apply to everybody. Now, you would think as an American, it says, well, everybody has the same ability, the same laws. And this is, remember that Sharia, the Muslim law code, is heavily personal items, marriage, divorce, burial, etc. So all of a sudden, the state is saying you have to have a secular kind of, not secular, but a uniform approach, which ordinarily would not be controversial. But in India of today, it's very controversial. And just a few days ago, in that very same state, Hindu mobs destroyed a mosque. So, and army activity was not, did not really defend the Muslims. What I'm saying is here, after decades of Hindus and Muslims sort of suspicious of each other but getting along, you now have an Indian government which is using Hinduism as a political drive. And so ordinarily, especially in Europe, when they talk about Islam, they say Islam on the march and Islam is creating crime and there's Islamophobia. Well, India has just the reverse here. You have Hinduism, which we've always thought of as a very tolerant kind of outlook on life, as being really very destructive in India. I'm not going to spend any more time on that, but because we're going to go back to the Middle East. But I just wanted you to, first of all, this is not only in the Middle East. But let's go to what a lot of us are more familiar with, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Remember that Iran is Shiite. Amidst Muslims, this is a tradition that puts an emphasis on an individual leader. And under the Ayatollah Khomeini, there was a reign of terror. There were executions, political reprisals. You had to become Islamically correct. And there are this morals police, which women in particular felt the brunt of because of the requirement for wearing the chadar. Remember, we talked about the different ways that Muslim women dress in different countries. And remember, every country says Sharia says this is the way. So like other religions, you have various interpretations of it. And in Iran, you had a very repressive regime, have a repressive regime. And it's interesting that the support for this regime comes from the small businessmen. They talk about the bazaris, those who have these stalls, who are upset about modern changes. And it's the urban lower middle classes and the poor neighborhoods that are supportive of the government and the morals police, or the kinds of stuff that we read about a lot. Khomeini was seen as the deputy of the imam of the age, and it's the first time in 1,000 years that anyone had claimed to be the deputy of the imam. Remember, there were 11 imams, and then the 12th imam is in hiding. What's called the occultation of the imam. And Shiites are not unified. There are a number of different groups, but the so-called Twelvers see the 12th imam in hiding. And this revolution in Iran against the secular Shah is really brought this messianic process in Shiism to a head. Now, then you have a war, remember, 1980 to 1988, between Iran and Iraq, a very brutal war, using, Saddam Hussein on the right there was our American favorite target. We didn't know whom they disliked more, Saddam Hussein or Imam Khomeini. But this war, which was probably started, I think, by the Iraqis, they saw it as a chance to expand their holdings. But the Iranians use stuff like children as cannon fodder, charging across open fields to clear the mines. It was a really ugly experience in those years, and it sort of ended in a stalemate. So the question is, was Islam involved? Saddam Hussein as a Sunni and Khomeini as a Shiite. It doesn't seem to be an Islamic war. They're all Muslims battering each other, although they're not really tolerant of each other. It's sort of like the Catholics and the Protestants in the 17th century and the early areas. You just want to get rid of your opponents. So what I'm going to do is look at a number of countries. I can't give you any solutions, but I'm going to suggest problems. And one of the issues is democracy in Islam. You have what's called the Arab Spring. I'd like to mention a few countries involved in the, quote, Arab Spring. In 2011, there was a stall keeper in Tunisia who burned himself to death as a protest against the government. And it broke out into riots, and the government was overthrown. And people saw this as a beginnings of democracy, because you started having movements like this all over the Middle East, in Egypt, Lebanon, Syria. So here is an issue, an example of Tunisia. Here's a demonstration. Tunisia first, Egypt second, Libya third. Or you have Turkey under Erdogan, who is, well, what is he? He is a democratically elected president who is using Islam in various ways. He has a record of being very conservative in Islam. In fact, he spent time in jail in the 1990s for some of his comments. But Turkey, for all the objections to Erdogan, is still a democratic country, although there are issues in terms of favoring Islam. The notion is that Islam should be, in his eyes and a lot of people's eyes, the dominant religion. and how you distinguish the dominant religion from the religion of the Kurds. Now, the Kurds are Muslims. So once again, people use Islam, but it isn't clear that Islam itself has a political outlook that's necessarily applied. Let's see, computer is not, there we go. So as I mentioned, the Arab Spring starts with the fall of Tunisia. And once again, there's another picture of this really excited crowd. And like most crowds you see in Arab countries, I see very few women, if any, involved in this. But then in Egypt, we got to keep moving that. Egypt begins to have its own demonstrations. If you recall, they had a President Mubarak, who was a former general. And he was, as the movement against him and the people on the outside had said, oh, the liberal forces, and Mubarak is forced out of office. And so we see these demonstrations in Egypt in 2011. People demand removal of the regime. I mean, a lot of times, why are these posters in English? And not part of it is to play for the international press. But still, it's a lot of people demonstrating. And it isn't clear. This, if you notice, especially in the left picture, these are women also involved. Egypt is a society that had progressed in many ways from our point of view. Even though Tunisia remains, even today, perhaps the most democratic of the Arab states. Although I should point out, and this is an aside, religious tolerance has increased in some countries, even in Iran, where we always think of people being repressed. Some universities mix men and women. Here's a picture of female firefighters in Iran. That is to say, they're taking jobs. They're not in a harem. They're not kept at home doing homemaking things. They also are involved in the economy of the country in many ways. And we don't always think of how many female firefighters do you know in Philadelphia. And the divorce rate in the Gulf countries exceeds those in some Western countries. There's always this issue of what is a Muslim divorce, where women have a lot of difficulty. But the point is that divorce is happening. But Islam becomes political. And it's opposed by those people who want a civil state. So, for example, you want to have a more equitable form of divorce. And in 2021, in Morocco, the Islamist prime minister is voted out of office. It's not a revolution. He's just, there is a democratic movement. Here's a picture of women in Morocco casting votes in 2016. So Morocco, in some senses, has been in the forefront of a liberalizing state. And what's happening in Islam, in many places, despite what we read about politics, there's a move to a personal quest for salvation, such as, it's a study group, the way of the spiritual Muslim, living in Allah's presence. That's the picture of the Kaaba, in the Hajj in Mecca that we looked at last week. And here's an example. Again, this is an opinion poll. Now, opinion polls change under the impact of politics. But in Iran, which is called the Islamic Republic of Iran, that's its name, where 99% of the population is Muslim, although it's split, it's not all Shiite, but in a 2021 poll, half of the 50,000 respondents said they had lost or changed their religion, and fewer than 1/3 identified as Shia. well, this suggests dissatisfaction with the government, and it could change. But, opinion polls are subject to changes of opinion, obviously. Uh, Around the world, though, clerics are lampooned for hypocrisy and greed. This reminds me very much of the Catholic Church before the Counter-Reformation. The clergy was really down in the dumps, and the Vatican understood that, and that's part of the Counter-Reformation and a drive, say, of Jesuits initially, but others to raise the level of the priesthood. Unfortunately, what we're seeing now in the 20th and 21st centuries is these sexual abuses that are being covered over by the authorities, so that that's a different notion of the clergy, and the clerics in Islam are not free of these charges, just as rabbis in New York are not free of these charges, and there's the same kind of cover-up that we see in other places. So this is not only Islam. I want to mention a little more about Egypt, because Egypt for so long was considered the leading Muslim country. Al-Azhar, the university in Cairo, was where the clerics talked about Sharia law. And here's our image of Egypt, the pharaohs, Nefertiti, Elizabeth Taylor. And here is Muhammad Ali. If you study the history of Egypt, in the early 19th century, Muhammad Ali is able to break the power of the Turkish Empire. And Egypt becomes really a major player. He's considered the founder of modern Egypt. And Egypt in the 19th century, in many ways, was a leader in economic change and in social progress. Whoops, I didn't want to do that. But in the 20th century, you have Gamal Abdel Nasser, who leads a revolution in the early 1950s against the monarchy. It was really a corrupt monarchy. Nasser was an army officer who led a group that took over the country, and he really was a leader all over the Muslim world. People looked to Nasser as a leader. If you recall some of these things, for example, in 1958, they tried to set up something called the United Arab Republic between Egypt and Syria. That didn't work. But anyway, Nasser was a spokesman for the non-aligned countries around the world. And here he is, just a very familiar pose. He was a very effective leader, but not a Democrat. He was succeeded by someone whom he had worked with, Anwar Sadat. Sadat was a quite religious Muslim. There is the notion of the religious Muslims having a mark on the middle of their forehead as they bow low enough during prayers that eventually there's a mark left on their forehead, and that was our image of Sadat. He was assassinated in 1981. He was followed by an army general, Hosni Mubarak, who was there for almost 20 years. 30 years. It became increasingly a military dictatorship. Islam is repressed, and we'll see a little bit about more Islam in a few minutes. But they have here's where we come to the Arab Spring. They have a free election, and Mohammed Morsi is elected president. Now, Mohammed Morsi was a member of something called the Muslim Brotherhood. We'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But he was accused of trying to clear out the entire bureaucracy and replace them with Muslims from the Muslim Brotherhood. He didn't last long in office. He was overthrown by the current man who's really a dictator, military leader, General al-Sisi. And that's sort of the situation in Egypt today. And El-Sisi and the government is very suspicious of any political movement in Islam. So what is the Muslim Brotherhood, which gets tossed around? I mean, even someone walking in here this morning said, I heard him mention, I think Rick mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood. It's founded in 1928 in Egypt by a man named Hassan al-Banna. And what it says is that you should apply Islamic Sharia law to all aspects of life, from everyday problems to the organization of the government. But this is a brotherhood of people who work together. You can't just walk in the door and get a party card. You have to study and become a member of the brotherhood. And in many ways, they're talking about really progress in social ways, schools, hospitals, and so on, in addition to eventually politics. They champion the cause of poor Muslims, and they become important in the Egyptian nationalist movement. And the leaders of the Egyptian nationalist movement aren't quite sure what to do with them. Here is a demonstration of Hassan al-Banna. But in the 1940s, they're accused of many bombings and assassination attempts. This is when the monarchy still existed. And under Nasser, they're banned. When you read about the Muslim Brotherhood, you have some people who say it's a spiritual kind of movement, and other people say, oh, they're liars. They have a military underground that they're just fronting for. They're probably both true. It depends where. But anyway, they are banned under Nasser. And then you have someone named, that's Hassan al-Banna is assassinated in 1949, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. And then you have another spokesman, Sayyid Qutb, who talks about the importance of restoring Islam with an Islamic vanguard. Now, he's executed, but this should be familiar to you, as there are still Muslim movements that say there should be an Islamic vanguard. Iran is an example. But there are other countries that also have this kind of movement. Sadat gradually released the brothers of the Brotherhood until they turned against him. And when he went to Jerusalem and signed a peace agreement with Israel, the Brotherhood really came out strongly against him. And remember, he's assassinated 2 years later. Anyone do that? But let's go back to where we were.
This guy?
Yeah, that's from the different Brotherhood. Let's see where we are. We're down, way down in Egypt here. Way down in Egypt. Okay. From the 1980s on, the Brotherhood is dominating professional and student associations. And here, Islam is the solution to all the problem of the creatures on earth. That's one of the things that they maintain. I mean, we as, quote, rational Westerners doubt that anything is the solution for everything. But this is really a belief. And in 2005, even though they were in Egypt, although they were still illegal, they won 20% of the seats in parliament. They're very popular because the government itself is so unpopular. Under Mubarak, it's a repressive regime. And in 2011, the Freedom and Justice Party, which eventually wins a majority, I shouldn't point out, it's very suspicious of political activity by women. We talked before about just how do women fit into these programs. For example, this is Mohammed Morsi, I think, who eventually became president. He says, a woman is not suited to be president because the post's religious and military duties conflict with her nature, social, and other humanitarian roles. I suspect that people would have said that about Hillary Clinton. So while underlining, quote, the equality between men and women in terms of their human dignity, this document, it's an official document of the Brotherhood, warned against burdening women with duties against their nature or role in the family. So this has been a conflict all over the Islamic world. You're aware of this, I'm sure. In Iran, women recently, this issue of wearing the chador. In Afghanistan, the return of the Taliban, which is really very repressive. On the other hand, other societies like Turkey and Morocco, women participate more fully. There is something called a Muslim sisterhood, by the way. They do mainly charitable activities. They're not quite political in the same way. I just wanted to say, here. The Muslim Brotherhood is the basis for controlling the affairs of state and society, and they're anti-imperialist. This is what gives a lot of the drive to the Islamic movements against Western imperialism. It was true in India and Pakistan. It was true in Iran. It was true in Egypt. Remember, Egypt was really controlled by the British from the 1920s to the 1950s, despite that they had a monarchy. India, of course, for several hundred years have been controlled by the British, and so on. Here is, again, Nasser banning the Muslim Brotherhood. In the Brotherhood, I mentioned this a minute ago, it's highly selective. It takes 4 years of study and apprenticeship to join. And let's see if we can see what this looks like. Here is Mohammed Morsi, and this is the famous Rabia. This is the symbol of the Brotherhood, the 4 fingers like this. You see it there in the sign, and you see Mohammed Morsi showing it. There's a Brotherhood rally. Well, is the Brotherhood a violent organization? Well, it is and it isn't. It is when it does all its peaceable social welfare, hospital activities. On the other hand, Hamas in the Gaza Strip is an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas, you can be as pro-Palestinian you want, but you still have to say Hamas is a violent organization. Well, in Egyptian politics, I'm going to try to move this out of the way here. When they first got into politics, they downplayed the perception of political Islam. But in 2012, Mohammed Morsi is elected president, as I mentioned. Here he is. He was seen as a real moderate in many ways. But what happened, he comes out and he says he promises to all Egypt and all its factions, Muslims and Christians, to be president for all Egyptians, a servant to them. Sounds good. It didn't quite work out that way. By late 2012, he issued a declaration allowing him to legislate without judicial oversight, which is essentially a presidential dictatorship. People call it an Islamist coup. And then General El-Sisi, whom I mentioned, leads a coup in 2013. They outlaw that political party, and they try to repress the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim Brotherhood is still there in 2024, but it's not dominant. Here, these are some pro-Sisi things. We'll go on. So is the Muslim Brotherhood a political party or a movement? In my mind, there are many parallels to the Zionist movement among the Jewish nationalists before 1948 and the Israelis afterwards. It's both. It takes elements of a religious affiliation and converts that into a movement for the resuscitation or for the reorganization or for the rebirth of a people. And in this case, they're saying the Muslims need to present themselves as the brotherhood, and that's what society should be about. Now, is it nonviolent? Muslim, we're back to that question. Well, it usually says it is, but, and here what we have here, it makes exceptions. We believe that Zionism, the United States, and England are gangs that kill children and women and men and destroy houses and fields. Zionism is a gang, not a country. So we will resist them until they don't have a country. This is that's the constant problem. The Israelis like to quote this when the people say, well, you need a two states as a solution to Israel and Palestine. Well, you have Israelis who don't believe that, and you have Muslims who don't believe it. I wanted to just, this is the idea of, I assume they're pointing to the Quran. I don't read Arabic, but this is, it gives me the feeling of what this brotherhood is saying. And by the way, one of the problems of the brotherhood, there's a different, I've read this, I can't read the Arabic website, but the Arabic website is much tougher, much more violent than the English language website. I mean, they know who their audience is. And here is the Rabia, as it's called. You can, it's a little easier than the dispute over how you cross yourself in the Russian church. Anyway, in 2013, Egypt declared the Brotherhood a terrorist organization, and then there was a problem. They ran a lot of hospitals and health services and schools, and they're important for Egyptian society. And the last thing about them, about Muslims in Egypt, is the Copts. Now, the Copts are a Orthodox form of the Orthodox Church. You know, it's when we say Orthodox in America, we often say Greek Orthodox, but there are many Orthodox churches. The Copts are one, and they're a significant proportion of the Egyptian population, maybe up to 10%. So, and these are numbers I've read, and Egypt's population is now approaching 100 million people. So there are millions of Copts, and there have been attacks and harassment. What? And you have a number of Copts fleeing from Egypt because what they see is that repression. Well, the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamist political parties continue in a lot of places. I just want to mention them. You're familiar with Afghanistan and the Taliban. That is, Taliban is a political party and a movement. A lot more violent, say, than the Muslim Brotherhood, but it's there. In Pakistan, you have a party called the Jamaat-e-Islami, and it's all over South Asia, and it opposes secularism. Let's see if we can move that out of the way. Vote for Jamaat al-Islami. Here, message of Jamaat al-Islami, and there's a demonstration for them. That is, this is something going on all over the Muslim world, from Pakistan, and even in Indonesia, it's now emerging. We're not going to deal with Indonesia here, but Indonesia is general, even though it has the largest Muslim population in the world, it has not been politically active, and now it's beginning to see some of that. In Tunisia, you have a Islamic Democratic Party. But, you know, I just saw this quote from General Petraeus. He sees a symbolic relationship between all these organizations, Al-Qaeda, Pakistani Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, this other group I'm not familiar with. They support each other, they coordinate with each other, and sometimes they compete with each other, sometimes even fight each other. But they are, he sees this notion of an Islamic political movement over, in this case, Western Asia, but I think it also applies to the Middle East. Gaza is in the papers every day. And Hamas is, in Israeli eyes, Hamas is the devil. In Palestinian eyes, it's the savior. It grew from the Muslim Brotherhood. That's the violent side that can happen. And is Hamas political or religious or both? When you read about Hamas in the Western press, you don't hear too much about the religious affiliation other than the more anti-Israeli. But in all these places, when there's blasphemy, that is to say, an attack on the religion, is that also an attack on the state? You saw, for example, this right-winger in Sweden who burned a Quran, and this becomes a political statement for Turkey and for Pakistan. Here is what it says is that Israel's war on Hamas spells a problem for Egypt because Hamas is now an Islamic hero. And al-Sisi is not interested in having an Islamic hero. He wants to control the state in a different way. And you probably are familiar now with this Israeli drive into Rafah, which is the border crossing into Egypt. And Egypt does not want an immigration of millions of Palestinians, which Israel would love to have. Ethnic cleansing is what they would really like. So I'm going over these various political clashes. We're not going into any depth, but I think some of these you have seen. Lebanon and Syria. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 is infamous for these two diplomats who really didn't have a good feel for the Middle East, just dividing up the map. Who gets what? And it's a continuation of the old French and British imperialism. And what they were getting at, were they going to dismantle the Ottoman Empire? It was spoils of the victor. Well, they got more than they bargained for. And so the League of Nations sets up something called a mandate system. That is, mainly Britain and France are going to control these countries until they're, quote, ready for independence. So here's Iraq. British are in Iraq as the mandate. In Syria, the French are in Syria as the mandate. And Lebanon, we have an issue. Lebanon becomes independent in 1943. The imperialist French have to pull out. But what do you do in a society which is so mixed by affiliation and religion? So they say the president, and this is still the law in Lebanon, should be a Maronite Christian. The Maronites are another one of the Orthodox churches. The Speaker of the Parliament is supposed to be a Shia Muslim. The Prime Minister, a Sunni Muslim. And the Deputy Speaker of Parliament and Deputy Prime Minister, Greek Orthodox. Well, this was power sharing in 1943, but the population has changed. It's much more Muslim than it was at that time. And you really have either a civil war or incidents boiling over. So there is a civil war 1975 to 1990, but you also have a Syrian occupation and an Israeli occupation. And if you recall, there was a time when hundreds of US Marines were killed by an explosion in Beirut. That is, it's become practically ungovernable. It has been, and probably in some way still is, dominated by Syria, but Israel got involved and they withdrew because they weren't doing too well there. And you have the formation of Hezbollah. Now, Hezbollah is a, quote, terrorist organization or a nationalist organization, depending who's talking about it. But it is Shiite. Hamas is Sunni. But here's a case where the two support one another. That is that religious divide within Islam is not dividing these anti-Israeli movements and anti-governmental movements. Remember, the revolt starts out in Syria in 2011 as part of the Arab Spring, and everybody thought that Syria was finished. Oh, let me just, I'm sorry. Just want to say this. The Hezbollah is Shiite. It was funded by Iran. It's inspired by Ayatollah Khomeini. And here you see a picture of Ayatollah Khomeini over here with someone Palestinian nationalist with the Palestinian colors. And this is a parade of Hezbollah soldiers. Their original goal was an Islamic republic, which the Shiites pushed more than the Sunni. And again, it's Hezbollah, a terrorist organization. It's an army now. And it's a very successful army in many ways. Moving on to Syria, you have another form of Islam, something called the Alawites. Now, the president of Syria is an Alawite. Alawites are not in good standing with majority Islam. They're neither Shiite nor Sunni, and many Muslims don't consider them Muslims at all. In 1970, Hafez al-Assad takes power, and Robert Kaplan, who's a very interesting writer about the Middle East, says that's like an untouchable becoming a Maharaj in India or a Jew becoming Tsar in Russia. That it's an Alawite to take over the whole country. That sentence really had an impact on me, make me understand how revolutionary this was, that Assad took over. And to this day, his family runs the country. They're all his relatives, and they're all Alawites. In 2000, Bashar al-Assad was British educated. He's an ophthalmologist, but he turned his eye to politics. And he is as brutal as his father. Here he is in 2014, I think that was, 2004. In 2011, there were attempts in Syria to duplicate Tunisia in the Arab Spring, but didn't work. And what he did, Assad, was to use Alawite themes against the Sunnis. And he and his father never hesitated to use mass murder to enforce their rule. So we get, you read all of this stuff about the Israelis killing Palestinians, which they are. It happens in other countries. I mean, under the father, the city of Aleppo had a revolt in the 1980s, I think, and they just killed 10,000 people. That's how you get rid of your enemies. So does Islam play a role? Probably not. I mean, they're all Muslims. It's politics. It's take the United States until not too long ago. Everybody in politics was a Christian. I mean, that didn't mean that they liked each other. That was part of their identity. And finally, coming to the end here, is Islam being depoliticized? Because what we saw, despite all these other things like the Taliban in Afghanistan and Syria with the Alawites, there were all these agreements between Israel, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, later joined with Sudan and Morocco, these so-called Abraham Accords, because these are Abrahamic religions. Remember way back when we talked about the Muslims trace their ancestry back to Abraham and his concubine Hagar and her son Ishmael. So those are the Ishmaelites. So we have these thoughts of full political normalization among these countries, and the war in Gaza I think, has repoliticized Islam. And in fact, my impression is that one of the reasons for the outbreak now is they were concerned that this depoliticization, and the fringe that friendship. But relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia were really working to the detriment of the Palestinians. And one of the things that they wanted to do and have done is to break up that relationship. I mean, the Saudis, they still want to have some kind of better relations with Israel, but they can't do it as long as this war in Gaza continues. Well, Islam is a solution. Islam will dominate the world. Freedom can go to hell. This is a real issue within Islam, and we're seeing it because, you know, in our westernized, democracy is the key to having people participate in government and have the most freedom. But there are other ways of looking at it. Sharia Islam is the solution. It's interesting that Morocco had a Islamic prime minister, but there's enough of democracy in Morocco. He got voted out of office. The problem is you read other reports about Morocco where people say, well, the king's family is just a bunch of crooks, you know, and they have all these Swiss bank accounts and they're using the country for that purpose. But Morocco, compared to some of the other North African and Middle Eastern countries, has a lot of signs of democracy with Islam still involved. And will the war in Gaza change the attitudes even in Morocco? Nobody knows. And as one scholar has written, the world is dreaming if it thinks the Islamist moment has gone. You know, it's going to be with us. We don't know what's going to be, but it certainly is part of our world. And it doesn't take just one form. So the Islamist movement in the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is different from the Islamist movement in Morocco, which is different from that in Iran and in Pakistan. But, you know, it's now, I'm not sure, it's possible that Islam is now the most populous religion in the world. So we don't know what's going to be. So I'm going to close that screen and we'll see if you have comments. We'll use a microphone. And then I'll try to repeat for the Zoom audience afterwards. Yeah, it's on. It's on.
It is on?
Yeah.
Thanks, Larry. You have a lot to cover and you did it with typical competence and sensitivity. However, I don't think you clarified the difference fully between the Shias and the Sunnis. My understanding is that one descends from one family branch of Muhammad and the other descends from another family branch of Muhammad. And then there's also, I wonder if you could make some allusion to the Sufi Muslims, the most poetic and literary and peaceful.
Okay, let me repeat for the people on Zoom. What Rick is saying first, I didn't deal with the distinction between Shias and Sunnis. Of course, going to mark him down as absent in the class when I did do that. But there, I mean, there's a historical reason for the distinction between them. But I was really interested in the political differences now, even though they start with who's the successor to Muhammad. And he also talked about the Sufis. The Sufis are not they're an approach to Islam. They're not a different group within Islam. And they're much more moderate, much more peaceful. They have their own ceremonies. You've heard of, sometimes we make fun of them. You've heard of whirling dervishes. Those are Sufis. But the Sufis really, I think they're talking about personal spirituality. And given the politics, that personal spirituality is one type one movement in Islam, and this violent anti-imperialist movement is another.
I think Rumi was a Sufi. And there is, finally, there's some paradox built into the Iranian Islamic regime that is expressed in really unusual social developments in Iran, namely the measure of freedom that's afforded to the cinema. And secondly, on the basic, on the fundamental level of the justice system that's exercised in a rather local fashion. And also understand that Iran was the first country in the world to authorize free, as it was this severe drug problem there, and they authorized free and open needle exchanges.
Yeah, what Rick is saying is that the picture of Iran as a monolithic government is incorrect, that there are things that people in the West might approve of or be sympathetic to. For example, freedom in the cinema. There are Iranian movies, and they have needle exchange as an example of liberalization. It's hard to know. Remember, first of all, that there are, even though that Iran is a Shiite country, Iraq has a large percentage of Shiites and Sunnis, and there's cross-fertilization, if you will. But yeah.
I just observed that it's ironic in a way that both India and Pakistan have had women as heads of states, and the US has not.
Yeah. The comment is that it's ironic that India and Pakistan have had female heads of state. Of course, the one in India was attacked as dictatorial and was assassinated, and the one in Pakistan is, the subject of attack by the army. That's always a problem in Pakistan. But you're right, and the United States has not achieved that. John?
I was curious why you said.
Turn the mic to this way.
I was curious why you said that I better formulate my question. You said that there was some consternation about the Israelis and
Palestinians.
well, no, not the Israelis and the no, the Egyptians,
The border in Egypt. I'm not.
the thing that they're trying to get, trying to work out now. That this was intimidating some of these people, and I don't understand.
Because I didn't use the word intimidate. What I said was Egypt does not want to see an inflow of large numbers of Palestinians. They don't want a new immigrant.
Oh, I can understand that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, see if you can think of a better way to
make an inflow of Palestinians.
Well, right now, Israel is attacking Rafah, which is the border crossing. So if the Palestinians flee, where do they go? That's it. One more question. Yeah.
So about Qatar, they're being active in negotiation between Hamas and Israel, and yet aren't they in the Muslim Brotherhood too?
Yeah, it's the position of Qatar is hard to figure out exactly what role they want to play. Just as they've always been attacked as being supporters of Hamas, and now they're playing an intermediary role, which is in some ways useful. I mean, you can't, if you're friends, you don't have any problem coming to an agreement. If you're enemies, you need somebody to bring you together. So all I can say is stay tuned in. We don't know what's going to be. I'm going to stop here. I'll be glad to talk to anybody afterwards, but thank you for coming. It's been interesting to me.